the water and mucked about the little islands and rivulets picking up the junk that had floated in overnight, or maybe some had just been bobbing there a long time before I came. It was hard to tell, stacking it up into a little pile of gunk. This is when some strange things happened. In one moment I noticed a bound book, half buried at a detritus bank around the shoreline. Having a feeling about it? So I crack it open, it's a bit encased in mud, and opened up a couple of pages. It was the annual collected issues of a business journal. There were lots of different issues with covers and stuff. It seemed business-oriented. At the back, however, was a list of the year's grants. That included scholarships for university work. Scrolling the list of scholarship grants, I saw in plain delight, my name. I haven't told this story to many people, but whenever they seemed unimpressed by this fact. Of course it was there. I did have a scholarship, and it was a business journal with a list of scholarship grants. I know, and I'm not saying it was paranormal necessarily. But understand how weird it felt to be the furthest you've ever been from home, pick a random book out of the water and see your own name in it. Regardless of how stupid it was, I fucking shivered. I closed the book and put it in the junk pile. Then stood to get up and saw a man standing on the other side of the stream watching me. Already a little unsettled, I nearly fucking shat myself when I saw him. It wasn't just that I hadn't seen a single other person on the property since I'd been there, it wasn't just that he was standing there, silently, looking at me, he was also standing half behind the trunk of a tree, so I could only see one arm and a leg and one half of his face. But he wasn't hidden at all and couldn't have been trying to be. He was just standing halfway behind a tree. His shirt and pants were a browny gray and pretty faded into the background, but his face and limbs were white and stood out in contrast. Before I have time to collect myself, I see his one arm waving at me, in a friendly gesture, not in a threatening way at all. I wave back and then stand there not knowing what to do, because he doesn't fucking make any movement, he just stays exactly where he is, looking at me. There's no way I'm approaching this guy, so I just wave again, kind of vaguely pointing towards my house to indicate I'm going inside or something. He waves back but still doesn't move. So I head back to the house, trying to carefully maintain a steady pace, for some reason not wanting to walk too fast to give away how rattled I was. Once I dared a look over my shoulder, and caught sight of his leg, turned back and going into the forest. Slightly relieved, I went back home and locked the doors. I wanted to latch the windows even, but the heat contained in the house was already great enough with them open. The wallpaper glue was visible on the walls like sweat. The isolated events now weighed on me heavily. While previously none of these weird incidents had overwhelmed my experience, was now unable to stop my heart racing, stop scaring myself with thoughts of that fucking man standing behind that fucking tree. With great difficulty I calmed myself enough to decide that heading into town was the best option. Not trusting the security of the place, I decided I would bring my laptop and shit. So I'm sitting at the table, brooding over my breakfast bowl, and become aware of a disturbance of light on my right hand side. I turn and holy fuck, there is a face right there. Swore aloud and stood up, nerves on the edge of actually fucking splitting. The face leans back and I see two arms raise. It's a man, his shift and whiteness making me instantly aware it's the creep from the swamp. I hear him say sorry, didn't mean to scare ya, or something like that, and say he didn't know the place was occupied, that he saw me down on the swamp and was intrigued by a stranger to the place. He asked to come in. I said yes, what else could I do, and went to open the front door for him. For a moment he stood on the doorstep, then smiled and gave me his hand to shake and said thanks and nice to meet you and such, then he came in. Up close the guy looked pretty old. He was encrusted in a tan but clearly white, and his skin looked pretty cracked up and wrinkled in places. His face had a spooky quality, even though it wasn't particularly fucked up. It's hard to explain. It wasn't a major difference or anything, but his face and especially his expression just seemed a bit younger somehow than the rest of him. Was probably just dazed off the heat and the day's events, but this has always stayed in my memory, how his face was just a little off. It was sort of awkward, Me walking pointlessly into the kitchen and him standing in the doorway between it and the hall, smiling but not talking. I asked if he wanted coffee and he said sure and sat down, then asked about me and what a whitey was doing out in the swamps. I told him about my studies and such, sort of vaguely, tentative to say too much to this weird smiling old guy. But as it turned out, he didn't seem to be remotely interested in me at all. He just smiled dozily, and as soon as I stopped talking started telling me about himself, without any indication of hearing what I'd just said. I put down the coffees and sat myself at the table as he carried on excitedly. He would sometimes get ahead of himself and just end a sentence with a jumble of gibberish words in this thick bushman accent. He didn't seem immediately threatening, but I definitely did not feel he was of his right mind. He said he lived up north but lived off the land in the swamp most of the time. For a long time he just spoke of tilling the soil and catching his own food, living in huts and shit, but then he awkwardly cracked out a peal of laughter and asked loudly, "Do ya got a girl here?" I was pretty taken aback, but before I could answer his smile completely flipped and he asked, suddenly almost angry, "Is there a girl here, mate?" I shook my head, but now the atmosphere had changed completely. He was gripping the table hard. And then just as quickly as it came on, this moment passed and he continued as if nothing happened. It was the most schizo thing I'd ever seen. I can't remember what he said after that, but eventually he showed himself out, coffee left untouched, and after walking a while down to the swamp looked back at me and said, as if touching on a shared joke, "Couldn't keep a girl safe here anywhere with all them bloody Warrigals," and walked off. Warrigals was the word used to describe Aboriginal people in like the 1800s. Fairly creeped out, I locked up and took my gear and the car out to town. The heat wasn't letting up and the car ride is in my mind a bit of a haze. Outside the school I saw another teacher packing her things into her own car. She waved and I pulled up beside her. I must have looked shaken because she asked what was the matter with him, to which she grinned knowingly and said, "Did he scare you?" She said he was mischievous but harmless. I remember her words, "He'll fuck with you but he doesn't hurt a fly, if it is him." She said he wasn't often seen. It was as if she were talking about a folk tale more than a real man. Apparently this man had lived near the area about 9 or 10 years ago. As recently as that, he had been a regular visitor to the town and a well-liked guy. She had been much younger then, but remembered that he would drive through town and sell veggies, and homemade jam, that he was fondly regarded by most. His wife was typically with him. She described them as a sweet old couple. The two were regarded highly enough that when his wife passed away she was buried near the grounds, and some friends from the town helped do the funeral. The guy was obviously distraught and seemed completely shell-shocked for a long time after it happened. His trips into town got less and less regular. His demeanor seemed subtly changed, still jolly but in a different, stranger way. His behavior was increasingly odd. Everyone understood his pain following the death of his only real close company, so when he referred to her in passing, her daily doings, as if she wasn't dead, there was mostly just sympathy, as well as the expectation that with some support he would get back to his old self. But things were only downhill from there. There were uncomfortable encounters where he asked people if they'd seen her around, to which there could be no easy response. The discomfort was not lessened when he started showing up disoriented, crying, telling people his wife had gone missing and that a search party needed to be formed immediately. Things came to a head when someone refused to dance around the issue and simply told him the fact of the matter: his wife was dead, buried not far out of town. By all accounts the man's response had been shocked, though not as unhinged as perhaps expected. He sort of sadly accepted what he'd been told and wasn't seen around town for a while. But when next he came back his behavior was only more fucked. He announced that he didn't trust a single fucking Warrigal and that he knew they'd done something with his wife. After some drunken spiels against Warrigals and anger at their having stolen his wife, keeping her captive somewhere, he was strongly dissuaded by some local leaders from coming to the town as he had used to and seemed to understand, because he wasn't seen in the town again. Word spread from some northern bars that he'd been seen drunk as a fish, telling anyone who would listen the swamp wargles that tormented his wife in her final days, driving her mad with their mischief, and how he hadn't believed her until it was too late. He was now fully convinced that a tribe had taken her away, and were holding her captive somewhere in the swamp. It also emerged that he had lost his house and his car, but he was still seen from time to time at the outskirts of the swamp, hunting. Eventually he wasn't even a regular at any bars, and as the years passed faded into a half-mythical figure. The mad old man of the swamp. Yet he was real. Sometimes hunting parties from the town would see him, even trade with him despite his now full-fledged hostility towards any and all wargles he met. So this was the story she told me. She stressed, as I will hear, that she couldn't confirm any of this, having only memories of the man's happy years and having not seen him since. Some of the tale probably was just the gamishing of legend. But that he was out in the swamp for long periods at a time was certain. And the hunting parties which came across him always reported that he was convinced of his wife's continued existence, as a captive to some unknown tribe somewhere in the swamp. Now this tale left me feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, but nonetheless a bit relieved. The frightfulness of this man was cut down a fair bit by the patheticness of his story, and I felt a bit sorry for him. But I didn't want to go home for a while and spent some time alone in the town before heading back out. I got home just past dusk, when there was still a faint light about things. But as I tentatively looked around the house, half expecting something to pop out and spook me, I was aware of a greater darkness than usual. It took me a while, but I investigated the windows and found that on those facing the swamp there was a growing layer of those fucking barnacle-looking mollusks. It's hard to describe what it was like seeing a cluster of these cramped up on the glass, but if you've seen the inside of a rock clinger, the fleshy part under the shell, you've got a good idea. I almost gagged. I didn't much want to, but I worked up the nerve to go out and scrape them off. Well, the whole bottom part of the wall was practically packed with them. A lot had been there a long time, or maybe had dried up and hardened in the sun, because scraping them off was like pulling teeth, and when they finally fell down they took a wee bit of splintered wood with them. Darkness settled and I was still going, working by the indoor lights and my torch. It was only once I'd finished, leaving a sickly smelling pile of the things at the base of the wall, piles of husks I couldn't be bothered to do anything with, then I realized how late it was and the deep silence that permeated everything. Little sounds were painfully heightened, enhanced by my frayed nerves, like the tiny drops of water somewhere nearby as a bird or a fish or something moved about, and the slight rustling of leaves on a mostly still night. I had the feeling of being watched. Now I was well aware that was just my mind playing tricks on me, but after the day's events couldn't be fucked putting up with this mischievous old cunt, so I quickly shone the torch across the tree line, fast enough to catch him if he tried to run away. But there was nothing. So I dragged the light along the bank slowly, scanning carefully for any signs of movement. Every sound I heard was him fucking with me, and I shook a little. Then, as my grip steadied a little, I saw it, a cluster of dead vines, or a tree maybe, half slumped, half wrapped around the base of a big old conifer. For whatever reason I couldn't help but focus on it. Something about it seemed distinctly out of place. Remember, I'd had a long time to get to know the panorama of the swamp, and something uncertain struck me about this white clump. Then, in one horrible movement, it pulled back and went behind the tree. For a moment I could do nothing, paralyzed by fear, when the silence was broken